to the Q&A and interactive parts of the briefing, please communicate your wish to speak in the chat, including the name of your mission or institution. Please note that the views gathered at this consultation will inform the recommendations of the Secretary General in his report to the 76th session of the UNGA on the Samoa pathway. We acknowledge that many of you do not yet have a set position on the topic of the MVI, but the purpose of this meeting is to inform you of the findings of the technical webinars that were held, organized by UNDESA, and to give an opportunity for the collection of your views before the formulation of the SG's recommendations. Of course, we will have more opportunities for political discussions as the process moves forward. So ladies and gentlemen, with that, I now have the pleasure to give the floor to the USG and High Representative for the LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS, Her Excellency Fakita Atokamanu, for her opening remarks. USG, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Tishka. Excellencies, colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this update on the development of a multidimensional vulnerability index for SIDS. First, I would like to thank our colleagues of UNDESA for partnering with OHR LLS on this important work. The work itself is undertaken pursuant to a mandate under United Nations General Assembly Resolution 75/215, Para 8A, which calls on the UN Secretary General, and I quote, to provide recommendations as part of his report on the present resolution to the General Assembly at its 76th session on the potential development and coordination of work within the United Nations system on a multidimensional vulnerability index for small island developing states, including on its potential finalization and use, end of quote. So in response to this request, efforts have been renewed to address the issues of SIDS vulnerability. The effort builds on the great body of work that has been generated both within and outside the United Nations system over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, at the last briefing a few months ago, OHR, LLS, and DESA laid out a roadmap for fulfilling this mandate. This roadmap provides for a series of briefings and consultations, both technical and policy in nature. The aim is to jointly tackle with all stakeholders and certainly many complexities associated with developing such index for SIDS. Since DESA and OHR LLS coordinated efforts of the UN system to respond to Resolution 75/215. In the past few weeks, DESA convened a series of 8 technical webinars to collect information on work currently undertaken towards the development of such an index. These webinars are critical to our efforts to better understand how an MVI for SIDS could be constructed and to look at what might and might not work, and to better anticipate the potential pitfalls that could emerge along the way. The technical webinars are completed. We now must hear from you, the member states. These consultations, on the one hand, will present the key findings of the technical webinars, and most importantly, will allow member states to share views, comments, and positions on the potential development, use, and finalization of an MVI for SIDS. I see it as critical that through these consultations, member states will be actively involved in shaping the process towards concrete results and workable outcomes for SIDS. Ladies and gentlemen, the development of a multidimensional vulnerability index for SIDS is not an academic exercise, quite the opposite. The development of such an index is not an end in itself. We're talking about a tool, and such an index is critical to facilitating evidence-based, targeted, and effective support to the SIDS in the framework of the implementation of the Samoa Pathway and Agenda 2030 in the era of COVID-19 and in the era of accelerating climate change and beyond. The development of relevant indices never is easy. The development of an MVI for SIDS will be no easy task. Yet it is now that all member states must come together in support of SIDS and set out a strategic vision and action path towards index development. We must look from the outset at the practical use of such an index, like how it could inform policy design and program support, how it could be used to access debt relief and restructuring, or what its role could be for access to concessionary finance through existing United Nations and non-United Nations sources. We also must see this in the context of how we can accelerate the implementation of the Samoa pathway. So together, let us develop a set of recommendations for the upcoming Secretary General's report on the implementation of the Samoa pathway, with the goal to secure the broadest possible support for the intergovernmental discussions at the 76th session of the General Assembly. I look forward to our discussion, your ideas and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, USG, for your opening remarks. We will now hear from Mr. Sai Navoti, Chief of the SIDS Unit in the Division for Sustainable Development Goals in UNDESA, who will give a presentation of the findings of the technical webinars organized for the development of the MVI for SIDS. Mr. Navoti, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Ms. Francis. The Undersecretary General, High Representatives of landlocked developing countries, least developed countries, and small island developing states, Ms. Kamano, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure for me to be giving this briefing on behalf of the Secretariat, UNDESA, and OHRLLS on information gathered during the series of technical webinars conducted in pursuit of the implementation of paragraph 8A of the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 75-215. I have a PowerPoint presentation, which I will now request Ms. Francis that I will put up on the screen.
Please go ahead.
Ms. Francis, can you see it on the screen?
Yes, I can see it. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Excellencies, you will recall that in our briefing on 17th February, we did mention that we will implement the request of the General Assembly in the most efficient, inclusive, and most transparent manner. The presentation this afternoon is divided into three main parts: the context and background, the MVI development, and the MVI use and users. Now let me move to the context and background. Excellencies, it's important, and as we just heard from the Undersecretary General, to remind ourselves once again of the mandate that we are working on. That is paragraph 8A of Resolution 75-215. The Secretary General was requested by the General Assembly to report at the 76th session the potential development and coordination of work within the United Nations system on a multidimensional vulnerability index for small island developing states, including its potential finalization and use. The operational word here is potential. Potential development, potential coordination, potential use, and potential finalization. Distinguished delegates, a total of 19 organizations and institutions were invited to make presentation in the technical webinar sessions. Their names, the session in which they presented, and their logo are reflected on the screen. The total number of attendees across all the 8 webinar sessions was 615. On average, meetings was involving about 77 participants. I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Secretariat to extend to each and every participating institutions our sincere thanks and appreciation for their work, their support, and contribution to this important work. Now let me move on to the MVI development. Distinguished delegates, in the course of the webinar session, it became apparent that there are 2 categories of work currently being carried out on the Multi-Vulnerability Index. The first were those who are currently working or developing an MVI. And the second were those who were working on thematic indices or thematic frameworks. Now, these were typically related to their respective mandates, as you can see on the screen. Now, the remaining presenters made comments about the MVIs or on how they are using the current MVIs of the United Nations to assist guide their work. Now, let me first turn to those who are working on a multidimensional vulnerability indices. Excellencies, observing the presentations of the 6 organizations who are currently working on the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, it was apparent from the start that 4 of them founded their work or have as the basis of their indices the current Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index of the United Nations Committee for Development Policy. 2 institutions began their work on the MVI from an original formulation. Excellency, the details on the screen currently in front of you, as displayed, are very small. We will be circulating a copy of this presentation, and we'll also be posting it on our division website for your further information. Now, another observations that we observed during the webinars relates to the geographical coverage of these indices. 5 of the 6 had universal coverage. Only 1 had its MVI exclusively covering small island developing states. Another observation was whether debt was factored into their computation. Only 2 of the 6 did. Now, 2 of the 6 organizations included all the 3 pillars of sustainable development in their computation: the economic, environmental, and social. 4 limited their computation only to the economic and environmental pillars. In terms of vulnerability ranking, majority of the presentations showed SIDS as the most vulnerable group, except 1 which had SIDS second only to LDCs. Other interesting observations include whether they considered resilience in their computation, whether past shocks were considered, or whether they limited their assessment to exposure factors only. It was also interesting to note the number of indicators used. The number used ranged from 8 indicators to 65. Excellencies, I mentioned above that 4 of the 6 organizations currently working on multidimensional index base their work on the current Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index, or the EVIs, of the Committee for Development Policy. It may therefore be useful for me and for us to take a quick look at the present committee's EVI. The present Committee on Development Policies Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index is structured around two sub-indices, the economic sub-index and the environmental sub-index, with each taking into computation the respective four elements that you can see listed in the blue and green shaded areas on your screen. From the presentations that we heard, the advantage of basing work on the committee's work or the committee's EVI include that it was already an agreed UN official index. It had consistent coverage across 143 countries and has been around since the year 2000. The methodology is agreed and it is reviewed every 3 years. And it is already being used to assess the vulnerability beyond the income criterion by some IFIs and some multilateral development banks. Excellencies, notwithstanding, the webinar series established that those who use the committee's EVIs as its foundation had either supplemented or replaced some of the sub-indices with additional criteria. These additional factors are those you see listed in the blue shaded box on the screen. The pink shaded rectangle reflects the comments or justification we heard during the webinar of why some favored the use of certain factors and not the others. Distinguished delegates, this slide shows the additional factors used by some organizations to build on the CDP's EVIs in the constructions of their own MVIs. UNDP use international tourism, remittances, and forest direct investments indicators. UNCTAD use climate change and economic exposures indicators. And the Caribbean Development Bank use the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: biodiversity, debt, openness, migration, tourism, financial flows, homicide, and gender-based violence, and poverty in their indicators. Now we have concluded considering those that built the index based on the CDP's current EVI, those that are shaded in yellow in the matrix that you currently see on the screen. Now, let's look at the 2 who built the index from an original piece of work, those shaded in green, that is the Commonwealth Secretariat and the Resident Coordinator Network in SIDS. Excellency, the submission by the Commonwealth revealed that their index is universal in nature, meaning that it is an index which includes all countries. Realizing the SIDS issue are factored in to its computation with all other developing countries. It captures, by way of indexation, changes in countries' net vulnerability over time, improving on the traditional statistic indices, realizing the importance of resilience in assessing the true magnitude and the nature of countries' vulnerability. The outcome of the assessment using the Commonwealth formula places SIDS vulnerability second only to LDCs. Its structure is based primarily on two pillars: the Structural Vulnerability Index and the Resilience Index. One advantage of the Commonwealth matrix is that it allows the isolation of exogenous or structural factors from non-exogenous, non-structural ones, allowing for smarter resource allocation in key sectors. As for the work of the United Nations Resident Coordinators Network in Small Island Developing States, it was observed that the indicators employed were chosen to reflect SIDS-specific vulnerabilities. Its structure consisted of three main pillars: economic vulnerability, structural development limitations, and environmental vulnerabilities. However, it was observed, based on discussions, that the RC's work did not include the factors you see currently reflected on the screen. One noteworthy observation is that while providing a large coverage, 196 countries, the index does not include vulnerabilities of other categories of developing countries, example, non-SIDS LDCs, making it somewhat less universal than its coverage might suggest. Excellency, now that you have completed looking at the work of those developing multidimensional indexes, let us now take a quick look at the work of the organizations who made presentations on thematic indices and framework. And as I said earlier, mainly in areas related to their mandates. Distinguished delegates, I want to underscore that our time is truly insufficient for a detailed account of the rich, substantive, and most informative presentations on the various thematic indices and framework submitted by the organizations whose names you now see reflected on the screen. I again reiterate that their presentations and the video recording of each of their technical webinar sessions are now available for reading and viewing at our division's website. Excellencies, each of the 10 presentations that were made can be classified as falling under one of the main headings, as you can see on the screen, and that is multidimensional poverty indices, the disaster risk and humanitarian risk index or indicators, and the human fragility and other framework. The main key message that was established from this presentation was that the thematic indices and framework presented strengthen the rationale for the integration of economic, environmental, and social factors in a multidimensional vulnerability index. Now, let me now move to the third and final section of the brief, potential use and users of the MVI. Excellencies, discussions on the potential use and potential uses of the MVI in the technical webinar sessions reveal that such a multidimensional indices can be used for advocacy, to emphasize the vulnerability of SIDS, and to advance the principle of leaving no one behind. It can be used for monitoring and evaluation, for measuring, and for evidence-based decision-making. In relation to that, It could assist in addressing debt vulnerability and support the achievement of debt sustainability. And on finance, it can be used as a tool to access to concessional finance, and the MVI could coexist with a GDP per capita criteria, and it potentially could be used to improve resource allocations by the international financial institutions. Excellencies, that concludes my briefing this afternoon. I remind participants of the links on the screen to the UNDESA Division for Sustainable Development website, where you can find a copy of this presentation, and other presentations and videos recording from the technical webinar session. I thank our Chair Lesh for organizing this very important briefing. Ms. Francis, I now yield back the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Navati, for your very comprehensive presentation on the technical webinars. This will help to inform our interactive discussion, including comparisons of key principles underpinning the various approaches considered, as well as the various uses an MVI could have. So we will now begin the Q&A portion of the briefing for technical questions on the webinars. After the Q&A, we will have the interactive discussion on how the MVI should progress. So with that, please again indicate your wish to take the floor in the chat, and I will respond to you as I receive the requests. Again, the floor is open for the Q&A on the technical webinars. Please indicate any interest to take the floor in the chat. I hope I am seeing the chat. Okay, I see our RC from Samoa, MCO, Simona. You have the floor.
Thank you so very much, Tishka, and many thanks, USG Utaikamanu, for organizing this important discussion, and thank you, Sai, for the good summary of the workshops, webinars that we had an opportunity to be a part of. I just want to make a few clarifications with respect to the MVI developed by the Resident Coordinator Network. And this is just in the spirit of ensuring that member states would have an accurate reflection of what each of the MVIs has brought about. The MVI that the Resident Coordinator Network together with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Professor Jeffrey Sachs developed has actually a wider coverage than all of the other MVIs, as it includes also developed countries. So our coverage is 196 countries and territories. We did include, while we tested and we developed an MVI that looks into the inherent vulnerabilities of small island states, considering the mandate, to be able to conclude that the small island developing states are the most vulnerable in the world, we had to run the index across, again, all of the countries, including developed countries. So you may remember that in the results of the regression that we presented, we also had Europe as a term of comparison. We had Latin America, we had the Middle East and North Africa, we had South Asia, so North America as well, as we wanted to demonstrate that by looking into the inherent characteristics of the seeds, we would come up with a conclusion that they remain the most vulnerable in the world. The second point that I wanted to make is that we discussed the approach to ensure that when we draw on inherent vulnerabilities of the seeds, we look into primarily exogenous factors. as exogenous factors will always present vulnerabilities and bring about risks and losses to small island states, whereas the endogenous factors can be actually corrected through policy and law and budgeting. So we wanted to make sure that we distinguish between the two, as that is what makes the small island states the most vulnerable in the world. So again, inherent characteristics. And we capture the economic vulnerabilities, environmental vulnerabilities, as well as structural development limitations that do have some social components into them. So through the computation that we conducted, again, using combinations of those factors, we concluded that seeds among themselves are different. So we have three distinct typologies: the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. And with the Pacific being the most vulnerable when it comes to the economic pillar, with the development pillar that is across the seeds presenting almost equal vulnerabilities, and on the environmental vulnerability with the Caribbean in the lead. So I will not go into the details of what we've presented in our webinar. I'm quite sure that many of the member states had an opportunity to listen to us. The conclusion is that if we use the MVI developed by the Resident Coordinator Network together with SDSN, small island states will fare as the most vulnerable. And within the use of the MVI, we also include
Simona, I believe you have lost your.
Sorry,
your audio is not clear.
One last word on the use of the MVI that I wanted to also introduce in my comments is that we did speak indeed about that restructuring. We spoke about concessional financing. We spoke about the importance of the MVI into better planning the resources we have, even within the limits of the existing ODA. The MVI helps the investments to be better targeted to address such vulnerabilities. And we also spoke about innovative new sources of financing, not concessional financing alone. We talked about dedicated financing lines for the seeds specifically within existing vertical funds, or even dedicated totally new financing flows for the small island states, looking into the model that the Global Fund brought about. But we also spoke about insurance, we spoke about compensation mechanisms, so new ways in which vulnerabilities could be managed. And we do have an analysis of resilience in our document, resilience being the capacity of countries to manage such vulnerabilities. And again, I will conclude by saying that we've identified that small island developing states have inherent vulnerabilities coming from the fact that they are small, which leads to lower long-term development prospects and potentials. Islands, which leads to larger interannual shocks, and remoteness that poses a significant burden on trade, access to markets, and overall economic performance. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Simona, for your intervention. I see no requests for the floor for the Q&A, no further requests for the floor for the Q&A section. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Mr. Navoti for your response before we move on to the interactive discussion. Mr. Navoti, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Francis. Yes, I would like to echo our appreciation to the resident coordinator of Samoa for that clarification. As we had earlier mentioned, the resident coordinators, particularly those from the small island developing states, and their work on this is a very important work indeed. And she has further elaborated on the good work that they're doing, and member states have taken due note of that this afternoon. I don't have any further substantive comment at this stage, so I'm aware that we are briefing the member states on all the information that was gathered for their information, and they can look for it themselves in the website of the Division for Sustainable Development to look into each of the detailed and very comprehensive work and presentation made by each of the institutions that made presentations during the 8 technical webinar sessions. With those few remarks, thank you very much, Ms. Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Navati. And just a reminder, the link to those presentations of all the various institutions were included in the concept note that we circulated before these meetings. So you can feel free to go back and check that link to further inform your deliberations on these important matters. So with that, I will now move on to the interactive discussion on the way forward. We ask that your feedback is centered around 2 key questions. Firstly, what are the principles and key elements that should underpin an MVI? As you heard from Dessa's presentation, key principles in question include whether the MVI should be universal or SIDS focused, and which elements for sustainable development should be included, such as social factors or debt issues. The second question is around what the MVI should be used for, and how do we build global consensus around that use. The vulnerability indices discussed in the webinars have been varied in construction, as we have just heard. For example, as tools to guide national policy development, or as criteria for programmatic or financial support in regional or global sources of debt relief or development finance. Different uses come with different degrees of challenges for creating global consensus. And so we would welcome your views on the use you see as most practical and what finalization means in the context of the MVI. I would like now to open the floor to representatives of member states for the interactive discussion. And the first request came from Guatemala on behalf of the MICS, the middle income countries. Guatemala, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. I have the honor of delivering this brief statement on behalf of the like-minded group of countries supporters of middle-income countries, composed of Armenia, Belarus, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Honduras, Jamaica, Lebanon, Mexico, Morocco, Panama, Peru, the Philippines, and my own country, Guatemala. Our group appreciates the briefing on the efforts of UNDESA and the United Nations Office of the High Representative for Least Developing Countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states to develop a multidimensional vulnerability index. We commend the development of such a tool because it more accurately reflects the needs and priorities of small island developing states as they seek to achieve the 2030 agenda while facing complex challenges in all 3 dimensions of sustainable development. We further stand in solidarity with SIDS, and the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the deep vulnerabilities they face. We also value the development of a tool like the MVI because it aligns with our own pursuit of a multilateral development system that uses multidimensional assessments of development that go beyond income as a basis to determine the support that can be provided to developing countries. In this sense, we highlight the complexity of addressing vulnerabilities in developing countries by noting that many countries in special situations are simultaneously categorized as middle-income countries, including some LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. Because of this complexity, our group will be interested in knowing if the MVI could be easily employed for the use of middle-income countries, notably those with similar vulnerabilities, such as to the adverse effects of climate change, to the global decline of international travel, or to the disruptions in global trade and supply chains. If this is not the case, do you think that the MVI could be a good basis to build upon and create similar frameworks for other categories of countries? We stand ready to actively engage with the UN system, particularly with DESA, the OHRLLS, and the UN Sustainable Development Group, the Committee on Development Policy, and others, to continue working toward an improved UN development system that can support developing countries based on their particular needs, including middle-income countries that are major engines of global growth and development, contributing to 1/3 of the global GDP and representing 75% of the world's population and 62% of the world's poor. I thank you.
I thank you for your intervention. Your questions and comments around the MVI and middle-income countries are well noted. I now give the floor to Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you, Tishka, and thanks to Madame USG and DESA for presenting this important meeting, for convening this important meeting. I apologize for my camera being off, but my bandwidth sometimes freezes when my camera is on. And also my apologies on behalf of my ambassador who's unable to join us today as he's engaged in another meeting. But again, thank you for the update on the engagement on the stakeholders discussions concerning the possible recommendations to be submitted to the SG. I think while my intervention is to offer a few points on behalf of AOSIS, we have shared similar points last week through a similar engagement. And so we do indicate that we will be probably be providing a more detailed response on behalf of AOSIS within the coming weeks. I think COVID-19 and the economic crisis has really brought to light the need for a tailored response for SIDS from the UN system and also the international community. And so we recognize that this tailored response should include a multidimensional vulnerability index. I think that is clear from the onset where SIDS are concerned. I also think that underlining the MVI is the need for the 3 dimensions of sustainable development and also a set of indicators that perhaps are reflective of the circumstances that SIDS are facing. We do recognize that there are various options to be considered, and so the group is willing to explore the most appropriate set of options that will address our particular vulnerabilities and our sustainable development needs. The USG pointed out that this is no easy task, and I assure you that the group fully agree that this is no easy task. I think some of the engagement that we had during the formulation of the language on the midterm review, the language found in the midterm review is a testament that this is no easy task. But we do think that it is important, however, what is needed is for support for SIDS during this process. And so AOSIS trust that we'll have the support of all the stakeholders in this process, especially where our development partners are concerned. We know the vote for the MVI includes the recommendations for the SG's report and then the intergovernmental process that will take place later on in the second committee. And so we're fully committed to continuing this process. As I indicated, that the group will provide further reflections on some of the questions that were posed to us. But our attempt today is to gauge the engagement of the different stakeholders and partners in the process. And so AOSIS can formulate a response going forward. I'll stop here for now, Tishka, but I'll perhaps intervene if needed as the discussions continue. Thank you.
And thank you, Tomasi, for your intervention. And we take note of the the indication that you will send in written comments, hopefully by the end of this week. And that is also available to other member states as well, to send in written contributions by the end of this week. With that, I can give the floor to Ambassador Prasad from Fiji. Please, Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tishka, and thank you, USG and Mr. Naboti, for a fantastic briefing. And I will make a few remarks. And thank you for those 8 technical webinars that DESA has conducted, and very good collaboration between OHR, LLS, and DESA, and increasingly, growingly, but still perhaps frustratingly, some evidence of collaboration across the UN system, but certainly not far enough. So my starting point of the discussion is, look, we have to conclude these discussions in about 2 years. In about 3 years, an MVI should come into life. We cannot be talking about this for another 20 years. Something is very, very fundamentally wrong, I think, at the starting point. And we just need to wake up and say that this is not rocket science, and what is usually not rocket science, it is not rocket science. We are talking about vulnerability. We are talking about many dimensions of vulnerability. We are talking about locking that into a framework and moving forward and finding pathways of how we bring that into life. So I don't think there's any very sophisticated science that is needed, and this certainly should not have taken 20 years for us to reach this stage. So that is not said in frustration. It is said with some amount of hurt, because you have seen how much SIDS, small states, have suffered in the COVID period. It's on a different scale, while others are talking about, some countries are already talking about recovery, some are talking about -5% economic contraction, SIDS are -20, -30, and totally collapsed economies. A few of them are looking even into the zone of fragile states and possibly into the collapsed states. So, you know, that is, how can that be rocket science? For those SIDS who have compounded, who have in the same period been impacted by a couple of climate catastrophes, it is just you know, on a different order. That is the fundamental problem that the Secretary General and the UN system needs to come to grips with. There are many problems. There are problems of poverty, there are problems of hunger, but the fundamental problem and the precise problem is that some states are exceptionally vulnerable, and one vulnerability put on top of another compounds the initial one, and the ability to come back is very constrained. So that is said as a statement of urgency. I'm very surprised that the SG has not given this much more urgency as is needed, and I'd really like to suggest to the system that we should try to conclude these discussions and bring an MVI into life in a couple of years' time. No more. I would much appreciate if that can be done even within 1 year, and Fiji would certainly work very, very hard to generate the political consensus that is needed. My second point is that in the SG's reporting, he should state what these dimensions of vulnerabilities are, that the numbers, etc., seems to prioritize. He should state the pros and cons of a universal versus a framework that is SIDS specific, that is the problem, a precise problem that is given. He should elaborate how widely the MVIs can be applied, and how he should and he can very clearly say how we can bring it into life. We can use MVIs, draft MVIs that are not politically agreed to already sensitize decisions. You could say, for example, that if the Green Climate Fund is already giving grants, you have a draft MVI of various types already. If you had used the various MVIs, what the decision would have been. So you could even, that type of loading would help us move the discussion forward. Some of the discussion is about concessional financing. Of course, it should help make decisions about concessional financing, which means that MVIs need to come into the purview of the World Bank, the Fund, and the African Development Bank, etc. So it has to come into that space, and that SG and the UN system are having very close dialogue, and we should be moving in that direction as well. And using it, even if there's no political agreement, beginning to use it to make the decisions behind the scene as these things are. Within the UN system, we are talking to SDG fund with private capital. We are talking to a whole range of investors who are already beginning to invest in SDGs, for example. Could private sector begin to use the frameworks that are already in place to begin to not necessarily make decisions, because political consensus may not be there, but think about how would decisions look like. An important part that COVID has brought, it's always been there, part of the vulnerability has been the issue of debt. So that should certainly feature as one of the core points. It's not only about debt and debt to GDP ratio, but also the ability of the economies to sustain debt over long periods of time, also the scope and level of financing instruments that are available to countries. For many countries, like my own, you simply cannot go to private markets, or if you do, you can do that at punishing rates of 20%, 15%, 10% type of interest rates, while larger economies can do that at 2, 3, and that type of. So there's a whole set of vulnerability that arises from how you access markets and to what extent you can access market. The SG's report should reflect on that. So there are whole ways in which you can piecemeal make an MVI begin to work already, begin to influence decisions, begin to shape perspectives, and as the system becomes more comfortable, they will make the decisions and bring it to life. Not all of those are within the gift of the UN system here. More and more of the resources are actually outside of the UN. So I really look forward to a very detailed report. I really look forward to the SG and the UN system really elevating this, because it is so fundamental and almost existential to small states, and that we are beginning to give a very clear timeline on what is the type of expectation we have of resolving this. And for countries like my own, we are willing to walk the last mile. We are willing to walk 24/7 to ensure that we have the level of political consensus necessary to get this over the line. We have to get this over the line, and this discussion should be at a much different level next time we meet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Prasad. Your intervention is well noted, particularly around the urgency for action around these issues, as well as your particular views for the SG report. They are very well noted. I see a request now for the floor from the UK. Please, UK, you have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tishka, and thank you to all of our colleagues in the Secretariat who've been working extremely hard on this. Likewise, thank you to other speakers for their comments so far, and I would echo the point around urgency so eloquently made by Ambassador Prasad. I would say, however, and I hesitate to say this on a call with 80 other people, that this seems complicated, and there are lots of EVIs and different sorts of vulnerability indices out there. And so, yes, it should be simpler than it is, and yet somehow it is not that simple. And so, you know, I'm sure my colleagues in Capital who are experts on this will be better placed to talk to the detail. But let me just try to come back to the guiding questions you set out and perhaps give a few reflections on those. Underpinning an MVI, we think there should be, it should be sort of universal, it should be balanced across the SDGs, it should be data-driven, evidence-based, and fundamentally it should improve development outcomes and the effectiveness of development cooperation. On the second question, from our perspective about, what should an MVI be used for and how do we build global consensus around that, it will depend on the final scope of the MVI. We've seen in the presentation that there are sort of economic vulnerability indices, there are more universal ones, there are sort of range of things, but fundamentally an MVI that works and is implementable and has good outcomes would, inform countries' sustainable development plans. They could be integrated into national financing frameworks. They could be used by donors to inform development cooperation. And all of this perhaps could help build the evidence base for why an MVI could work and why it would lead to better outcomes. And of course, as part of this, and as Sai's presentation very helpfully outlined, a lot of organisations who are working on this have been consulted already, and that's incredibly positive. And from a UK perspective, it's important that these organisations continue to be consulted and involved, so that the sort of consensus on this can be reached, and we have something at the end of the day that works for everyone. And once it works for everyone, we will have good outcomes and a system that works for all. So those are some initial reactions, but like others, we will reflect further on the presentation and continue to keep in touch with this, and also listen and respond to other colleagues who will take the floor in the subsequent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for those very useful initial remarks, and we look forward to further comments as we proceed. Next, I have Australia. Australia, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, Tishka. Thank you to everyone this afternoon who's made presentations, and thanks to colleagues and excellencies who've spoken before me. I do, and perhaps I do apologise. I probably should have asked this during the Q&A session, but I am going to pose some questions. Before I do, I wanted to take the opportunity to really echo the comments of Ambassador Prasad. Australia is totally of the view that this is urgent. We're very concerned about how long it's taken to get this off the ground, and we would really like to see this brought to life urgently. So we thank you for all your work so far, and we look forward to seeing particularly how the SG's report intends to stand this up across the development system and bring it to life across the development system. Given that there are various entities across the development system who may currently be using different metrics, as we've seen in Sai's presentation. To return for a moment to Sai's presentation, I do find it really interesting. It sounds like each of the various models that you looked at offers different sort of benefits, but no single one was perfect. It does sound to me a little bit like possibly the model put together by the SIDS resident coordinator group was probably the closest to I guess the what is being strived for in the mandate that was given in the 2C resolution, and that's something that and I guess I differ from my UK colleague a bit here. I think beyond being universal here, I think this actually needs to work best for SIDS. It was created for SIDS. I do believe that that is where vulnerability is currently least understood. Many of the models indicate that SIDS are the most vulnerable. So I think that first and foremost, the MVI needs to work for SIDS. I would also just like to quickly ask about the team's reflections on use of economic indicators. One of the sort of underpinning drivers for this MVI process has been, I think, an increasing recognition that use of GNI or GDP as indicators that they're highly misrepresentative indicators, really, for small island developing states, or what has been called the island paradox, that they don't really reflect development realities on the ground. So I wondered about how that's played out in this piece of work, and whether you do think that the MVI is able to replace the use of those kind of blunt financial indicators, or whether I noticed, Sai, you mentioned that one of them would be was being used kind of as a complement to GDP, and I wondered, what is the point where we're less reliant on those financial indicators? Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabella, for raising all of the difficult questions in one intervention. As you know, some of these questions we will not be able to answer during this briefing, and will depend on how matters progress. But we will have taken note, of course, of these questions, and I will give the floor to Sai to respond perhaps in more detail to some of your questions once we take the floor. I think we have 2 more requests, and then I will hand it back over to Sai to respond as well. So with that, I will give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, distinguished moderator. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
Thank you for convening us today, and distinguished USG colleagues, good afternoon to everyone. And let me also share first reflections and impressions from the issue under consideration. First, to join our colleagues, we support the idea of development of a framework, multi-dimensional vulnerability index, as raising visibility of problems that so many countries are facing, especially in the context of COVID, and monitoring, informing the policy design. And we, of course, agree and share the approach that was taken upon by the drafters of this proposal, that all 3 dimensions of sustainable development could be taken into consideration here, and across the sustainable development UN-based approach, this index in the end of the day could be worked out. We would propose to kindly think of any other urgent and emergency criteria that could be taken on board here, like also having relation to geopolitics and conflicts, for example, criteria of suffering from unilateral coercive measures by so many countries could be taken also into consideration. And here we come to the idea that also some distinguished colleagues have already raised, that not only one group of states could enjoy the benefits of such multi-dimensional vulnerability index being worked out. We could think of also LLDCs and middle income countries that have already raised their position to be also a part of this work. For them, a multi-dimensional vulnerability index also to be worked out. We think that this could be taken on board from the very beginning, so that when we have outcome of this work, this MVI could leverage cooperation with more countries, not only a separate group of states. And in this regard, we will be happy also to submit written reflections after consultation with the capital. We hope that the deadline that the co-organizers have proposed to the delegation is not final. We have some more time. We'll have some more time to think it over. And also, as to the technical organizing this work, would appreciate if member states would be given an opportunity to reflect on their attitudes and impressions on the idea and proposals on the MVI as a part of inputs that they're preparing now to the report of Secretary General. The questionnaire and the invitation to prepare these inputs are there, and we have there, and we are also in the process of studying, but probably as a separate part of this work, the MVI being a crucial and a new issue on the table in the United Nations, could contribute to for our work to be more complex and effective. And we think that with the sense of urgency, with the sense of emergency, it is very important how we start, so that we could move quickly afterwards. Thank you very much. Looking forward to consultations and cooperation with the OHL LLC and other involved agencies. Thank you.
Thank you to the Russian Federation for your initial feedback on these important matters. We take note of your request for the extension of the deadline, and we would ask that you send in your written contributions as soon as possible, as soon as you can. I think we have one more request to the floor from the EU. EU, please.
Thank you very much, Tishka, and good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to all the colleagues. Apologies for not having my camera on, but similarly to some other colleagues, I have a problem with my internet connection. First of all, thank you for organizing the meeting. Thanks to the USG and also for colleagues from DESA and the OHLS, and also from resident coordinators for their presentations. I have to make a caveat that I'm speaking not on behalf of the EU and its member states today, but more in the name of the European Union's delegation to the UN. So my colleagues, of course, will be able to take the floors in the national capacity if they wish so. First of all, a few observations of today's meeting. I have to say that I'm personally super grateful for really excellent description and an overview of the work that is currently being done on the issue at hand. Thank you, Sai, for very clear slides and presentations. Thank you also for making them available, because I think that due to the wealth of information contained, they do deserve more detailed analysis and really detailed look. I think they provide a really excellent overview of where we stand in terms of different indices that deal with certain aspects that we've discussed in the context of the MTR and in the negotiations of the second committee resolution on the Samoa pathway implementation. I have to agree with and actually agree with many points made by Ben, by our UK colleague today. But I agree above all with the statement that this might not be a rocket science, the development, potential development of the MVI, but it is a very sophisticated type of work, and it's a very complex one. And I think the presentation only proves that. I have a question though about how, first of all, the DESA's and the OHLS approach to the outcomes of these technical webinars. All these comparisons between different indices that are used by different organizations or different bodies or different agencies within the UN system and outside. How do you intend to pick up on the work done in the context or the discussions that were held in the context of technical webinars? Is it something that you are looking on and analyzing in preparation for the SG report containing the recommendations? And then I think also the presentation proves that there are a lot of indices already in place. So there's a lot of work that has been done already on trying to reflect the vulnerabilities that we're talking about here in the work across the UN system and outside of the UN system. This, of course, to me, screams overlaps and duplications. What is your thinking currently in terms of trying to avoid that? Is the potential MVI that we are currently discussing in the UN, in the GA, meant as a replacement or will be advertised as some sort of a tool that will be used across the system? Or is it going to be some sort of a complement to what is currently used throughout, well, globally or regionally by various organizations? I also understand that, of course, you might not have the definite answer, but you surely, in preparation for the issuance of the report, are thinking about these issues. So I was wondering whether you could maybe reveal some insights. I also wanted to thank our colleagues, resident coordinators, for the resident coordinator in Samoa for speaking a little bit more to this to the multidimensional vulnerability index that has been developed by the RCOs. I think I would like to echo some of the questions posed by Sibylla, our Australian colleague, on some of the nitty-gritty aspects of it. I noticed that in the presentation from DESA, there was a mention of some of the omissions, some of the elements that were omitted in the RCO MVI, such as, for example, death or biodiversity. However, when I personally look at the elements that are included in this index, we are talking about economic vulnerabilities and environmental vulnerabilities. So I'm just wondering about the scope of application of these two notions in the MVI, and if indeed they have a little bit of a more narrow scope that doesn't cover, for example, all the aspects of what I would perceive personally as economic vulnerability, for example. So these are some reflections from me. Thank you so much. And we are of course, very closely following the work of the UN Secretariat on these issues. And of course, we are very much willing to engage actively in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka, for your always useful comments and questions. Just to note that the findings of the technical webinars and these consultations will be analyzed as we prepare the SG report, the recommendations for the SG's report, as well as they will feature in dedicated publications by OHRLS and DESA, which will explain more in depth the differences between the range of vulnerability and multidimensional vulnerability indices which are being developed, and how a potential MVI, as Sibylla had noted, can be brought to life across the international development system. I will also give the floor to Sai to respond a little bit to some of the questions that were posed. Also, I see some of the questions were posed directly to Simona, so I will give her an opportunity as well. But before that, I will give the floor to Naru. I believe I saw Naru ask for the floor. Naru?
Thank you, Tishka. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yep. So this is Anadela from Nauru. I apologize for not being on screen. Similar to other colleagues, I also have connectivity issues. We just want to take this opportunity to thank OHRLS and DESA for the comprehensive briefing and their work thus far in this process, and also to echo the chairs of AOSIS and PCIDS on the importance of the MVI. Our preliminary views is it is important at this in this opportunity at this juncture that we do not lose momentum on the MVI and the urgency to get the work done. Consistently, we have reiterated that the use of GNI as a measure for development is not adequate, very one-dimensional, and does not recognize the special case or the challenges faced by SIDS. We would also like to take this opportunity to reiterate that the MVI can be a critical tool to reflect our true development status, and that there is not a one-size-fits-all rather than to develop a more targeted approach to the needs of seeds as we build on our resilience, especially as countries facing the existential threat to climate change. It is a lot of information, and we are working with our capitals to get back to you, and we will be engaged in this process. And I thank you.
Thank you, Naru and Adela. Thank you very much for those, and they are well noted. So now I see no further requests. Can I ask Tomasi, you had indicated earlier that you might want to come back. Do you want to come back at this time, or shall we proceed?
No, you could proceed. Thanks, Tishka.
Okay, thank you, Tomasi. So I'll give the floor to Simona very briefly to respond to some of the questions posed directly to you, and then we will move on to Sai and to close the briefing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tishka, and many thanks to all comments and questions that also refer to our MVI. So first of all, our narrative beyond the PowerPoint, so the next step, our narrative will be ready the following week for us to be able to share. And I think the narrative further explains the selection of indicators and the overall approach. We wanted the index to be measurable. We wanted the index to be simple. We wanted the index to speak to the vulnerabilities of the seeds. With respect to the questions that came from Australia, I would like to clarify that there is no indicator in our selection of indicators based on which the MVI is measured, linked to referring to the GDP, whether GDP or GDP per capita. There is no such thing into our approach. However, we do test the MVI versus the GDP volatility that is so specific to the seeds. And if we all remember, one of the MVIs on the table was the MVI that was prepared by the Prime Minister of Barbados, in which she speaks about the volatility of GDP around its trend, which tends to be much larger, much wider than for the seeds than for the rest of the world. So in our analysis, the MVI, the way we measure it, does explain and could be easily linked to the GDP volatility that, again, is specific to the seeds. The other point that I wanted to mention is that we do have in our analysis proxies to the debt situation of the seeds. So the debt is obviously a result of small island states being small and having a small fiscal space. It's also due to increased losses that they experience through shocks, all sorts of shocks. And of course, undiversified economies due to other limitations that seeds have. So as a result, there is a high dependence on ODA that is very specific to the seeds. So seeds have actually a dependence on ODA that could be reflected into a very, very high percentage of the income per capita. So in the Pacific is above 10, I think it's close to 15%. ODA per capita in the small island states of the Pacific. That's the closest I've recently analyzed. So if you look into our economic vulnerabilities, we talk about income dependency from abroad, and among the items there, we also speak about ODA. And this is, of course, a consequence of a limited fiscal space and the high indebtedness that would not allow further borrowing. And I just want to mention that in the use of the MVI, we put something that we now saw in the outcome document of the ECOSOC forum on financing for development follow-up, which is helping countries through using the MVI to pursue that restructuring and build credit worthiness. So seeds do not have credit rating. Seeds cannot actually access a series of, commercial borrowing has become almost impossible to the seeds or very limited because of their very high indebtedness. I just want to add one more point that because of coming to the last questions that was posed by the European Union representative, we do have in our analysis something that is very specific to the approach we took, which links the MVI with the very slow SDG progress. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network, our partner, also issues annually an SDG index that looks into achievement of SDGs across a very high number of indicators being selected. So because we have the SDG index as well on the table, we show into our presentation, if that's accessible on the website, on the link that Dessa shared, that the higher the vulnerability, the slower progress on reduction of poverty on SDG 1, the higher the vulnerability, the poorer the health outcomes, the progress referring to SDG 3 specifically. We also have an analysis of the MVI across SDGs defining well-being. So that's our approach to showing that vulnerability actually generates increasing social problems for the seeds. And without additional resources, seeds have no means to be able to build resilience. So vulnerabilities, the response to vulnerabilities is far above the capacity of small island states to generate their own means and to access means that would allow them to, respond to, contain the impact of vulnerabilities and build resilience. So I think the narrative will further explain, but just to mention that there is nothing that has been discussed that is not one way or another captured into our approach, either through a proxy or just showing the link between the MVI and that particular development for the seeds. And we just want it to remain as simple, as clear, and as seed specific in our approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. And I already see some comments on the chat saying that your comments were useful, so thank you for that. Now I would give the floor to Sai to respond to some of the questions that were raised as well, particularly around the webinars. Thank you, Sai.
Thank you, Ms. Francis. Let me begin by, first of all, thanking all the distinguished delegates, their excellencies, for their comment this afternoon. The Secretariat has taken due note of their intervention, and we are very pleased indeed to record them for the purposes of this very important undertaking. There have been some specific questions asked of the Secretariat, and as you observed, Ms. Francis, some of them, the gravity of which may not allow both of us to answer them adequately at this stage, purely because the Secretary General is in the process of accumulating all the information that has been gathered, particularly from the technical webinars. However, let me just refer to the question from Ms. Stern, Sibella, from the Australian delegation. She asked a few questions, and I'm glad that the RCO of Samoa has addressed some of her observation. The question relating to this global domestic product, GDP, and the MVIs. We can only say as Secretariat, from what we heard in the webinars, I can confirm that none of the submission, in fact, none at all, was received to suggest that this exercise would be a GDP versus MVI kind of exercise. In fact, majority of those that made the presentation all commented that this would be something complementary to the MVI. And that is as far as I can say for that particular question, Ms. Francis. Now, I noticed that the delegation of the European Union Secretariat asked on how the Secretariat intend to use all this information. I can confirm that the Secretariat will use all the information that has been gathered to benefit the Secretary General in putting together a set of recommendations towards the 4 themes that was asked of him by the General Assembly. Information gathered towards the development, towards the use the finalization, and the coordination of work. And I do not wish to prejudge at this stage the detail upon which the Secretary General will delve into, but we can assure member states that all the good work that are currently being done will be taken into consideration. And finally, the colleague from the Russian Federation, Ms. Francis, was asking about some kind of a deadline. And on this, I want to clarify to member states two things, and Ms. Tishka has alluded to this early. One is the Secretary General report itself. Most of our distinguished delegates who are tuning in today are fully aware that the Secretary General's report itself is a limited word document that is only limited to 8,000 words. Therefore, there is only some words restrictions on the limitation of the word that can be used on the MVIs. And I think it's a matter of public record now, and the mandate of the Secretary of the General Assembly requested already that 2 reports will also be reported together with the MVI this session. And that is the outcomes from the midterm review of the Samoa pathway, the indicators for the Samoa pathway, and the study for the funding on disaster risk environment. Now, those 2 reports, together with the MVI, will populate this year's Secretary General's report on the Samoa pathway, including the normal report on the implementation of the Samoa pathway. So when I say that, I am reminded of the information that was earlier communicated by Ms. Francis, that there is another piece of report that the Secretariat is working on. Now, this report is intended to be complementary to the report of the Secretary General, the official report of the Secretary General, the intention of which will be to further detail the reasoning behind the work that the Secretary General has reflected in its report. It should be read in one of the same vein, and Ms. Tishka can elaborate that further if she wish, but that is the thinking of the Secretariat. Because the Secretary General's official report has word limits, it will be futile for this exercise to try and cramp every single word into the Secretary General's report that accurately reflect what the Secretary General's would be intending to communicate in terms of his recommendations. But for the Russian Federation question regarding deadline, it is important at this stage if all delegation could please, at the best as they could, bring all their views and comments to the Secretariat by the end of this month. We request that if you would like your views to be considered and included into the thinking of the Secretary General. You have about 20-something days for that exercise. If you can bring it by the dead end of this month, we can still have the opportunity to look at it. So those are some of the comments from my side. And Ms. Francis, if I had missed something, please, you can help me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sai. I think that was quite sufficient in terms of the information that we have at this point. We have, I think, come now to the end of the briefing. And as Sai mentioned, we have taken note of all of the interventions, of all of the questions. As we move forward, we want to show exactly what sorry, I'm seeing, comments from the floor. Sorry, Tomasi, let me give you the floor before we close. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Tishka. I think Sai's intervention probably had me a little bit curious now, and I understand the circumstances on the word limit and the different elements of the report that's needed. And so the complementary document that Sai did indicate, and I think you referenced earlier, would that be released at the same time of the SG's report, or would that be released in advance of the SG's report? That's one question. And then the difficulty is that that complementary document, which I hope will be substantial and perhaps good. I think what's playing in my mind now is how would we be able to use the elements from that document in the intergovernmental process if it is not recognized as an official, I guess, release of the Secretary General. But just more importantly, in terms of the release of that document, would it be in advance of the SG's report, or would it be around the same time of the release? Thank you.
Thank you, Tomasi. We have not yet finalized the timing of the release of these documents. It's still very much in the early stages of development, but we will provide that information to you as soon as possible. It will be there to help inform the discussions in the GA later on in the year. But in terms of the exact timelines, we will share that information with you as soon as we have finalized that information. And we, of course, will provide other information on that as well. So we will keep you informed, and we will remain engaged with you throughout the process. So with that, colleagues, I want to wrap up the meeting now, and just to reinforce what Sai has mentioned with respect to the written submissions. We will hopefully have them from you as soon as possible, and you are free to engage with us throughout the process, as I had mentioned. We foresee the SG's report being released tentatively in August, and of course the consultations in the second committee will begin in October. So, but again, we will be at your disposal throughout. So I thank you all for your, sorry, I'm seeing a request for the floor again. Sorry, I missed. Is that Simona?
Yes, I just wanted to, Tishka, just very briefly, and thank you so much for allowing me to say a few more words, 30 seconds. Samoa, together with SDSN, would like to organize a side event at the HLPF in July dedicated to the MVI, in which we hope we will have an opportunity to discuss various options. I'm sure there will be many of the entities that presented in the webinar cycle would be interested in also sharing with the member states their work. So we will announce the date, and of course we'll work with UNDESA and OHR-LLS in the organization of the HLPF. And my last point on the on another question of Australia with respect to the use of the MVI, in our analysis that was done to come up with construction and architecture of the MVI, we realized the importance of a vulnerability analysis assessment that could inform national policies, bilateral engagement, as well as multilateral engagement through cooperation frameworks and programs. It is extremely important that development cooperation for the seeds does not look into the GDP per capita alone and the size of the population. The MVI could be the best additional criterion to the existing makeup based on which development cooperation goes to the seeds. So again, even if there is not additional money within the envelope we have, we can target better the issues that seeds are facing. Thank you. And sorry again.
Thank you, Simona. And just to wrap up, the OHR-LLS and DESA will be at your disposal throughout this process to answer any outstanding questions and to take your contributions with respect to developing the recommendations for the SG's report and the work on this very, very important issue. So thank you again for your active engagement today, and we look forward to receiving your written contributions as soon as you can. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.